Hey guys, I'm back by the fire, and I have another awesome story to share with you. Today's story is this epic survival story. And I mean, the story itself is truly unbelievable. But I'm telling you, the twist at the end, basically how this person was able to survive, you will not see coming. Great plot twist, great story. I know you're gonna like it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right campfire, because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to come on down to your campfire, but when they get there, just immediately push them into the flames and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 10, March 18th, 1944, a 26-year-old Finnish soldier named Amo Koivunen sat around a campfire with a group of other soldiers inside of the Arctic Circle in Northern Europe. They were very deep into the wilderness, in this forest that was covered in several feet of snow, and Imo was melting a pot of that snow over the fire so the group could drink some tea. And at the same time that Imo was doing this, even though it was kind of relaxing to be sitting here, I mean his whole body was basically aching. Number one, it was, 5 degrees outside, and this was also the first time that he and the other soldiers had stopped to rest in about 2 days. They had been on the move the whole time. At this point during World War II, they were allied with Nazi Germany, not because, they were Nazis. They were not, but because Finland and Germany shared a common enemy, the Soviet Union. Right now, Imo and his squadron were in an area called Lapland, which used to belong to Finland, but for years earlier, the Soviet Union had invaded Finland and ultimately forced Finland to cede this land to the Soviets. But now, during World War II, Finland wanted to get their land back, and Germany was helping them do that. And so Imo and his squadron were in Lapland on essentially a reconnaissance mission. They were there to try to figure out sort of what the Soviets were doing in this part of Lapland and how many Soviets were out there. Again, in this particular part of Lapland, however, Imo and the others had spent the past 2 days skiing all over the place in their area of operations, but so far they hadn't seen any Soviet soldiers or any Soviet bases. But for Imo, and probably for the other soldiers that he was with, this was ultimately a good thing. They weren't trained for combat, but they didn't necessarily want to come across Soviets and have like a full-blown shootout, in part because the Soviets were just a bigger, more well-equipped military and, they were also more advanced. And so, if they got into a gunfight with them, who knows what would have happened. And so, even though Imo was like sitting here feeling very sore and very tired as he melts his snow, he was ultimately feeling kind of grateful that this reconnaissance mission had proven to be pretty low-key. However, just as the water began to boil, Imo and the other soldiers heard the unmistakable sound of machine gun fire coming from somewhere that had to be nearby. And so, immediately, Imo and the others, they jump up, forget what they're doing, and they're just looking to see where this gunfire is coming from. But then, before they could even make sense of the situation, Imo's lieutenant yelled like, "Hey, get ready, get your guns." So they all scooped up their weapons. Imo's picking his weapon up, and as he looks up, he looked off in the distance, maybe a quarter mile away, and he was shocked to see an entire pack of Soviet soldiers bearing down on them. They were literally skiing down this mountainside right nearby, and they were obviously shooting their machine guns, not in random directions, but right at Imo and the other men. They were clearly being attacked by these Soviets. Now, Imo and the other men have clearly been trained for this. This is literally why they're out here. They are soldiers, they're ready for this type of encounter. But for a moment, when Imo sees this overwhelming force that's descending on them, they're clearly outnumbered. Like, this is gonna end badly. All Imo had in his head was just this overwhelming feeling of just terror. He was the oldest of 6 children, and when he first enlisted in the military, he had promised all of his little siblings that he wouldn't get hurt. He would come home, he would be okay. And now he knew that wasn't gonna happen. Like, he was gonna get killed. He just knew it. But at this point, Aimo, he looked over at his lieutenant to get orders. But Aimo, after sort of breaking out of this initial thought, he looked over at his lieutenant, and his lieutenant looked terrified too, but he quickly composed himself and yelled for Aimo and everybody else to flee. Just moments later, Aimo and the other Finnish soldiers were on their skis, skiing as fast as they could away from the Soviets down the backside of this mountain, just doing anything they could to survive. And as Aimo's skiing away, he can hear the sound of gunfire ricocheting off trees, zipping by his head. Like he's thinking at any point I'm gonna get hit, or one of my teammates are gonna get hit. There's nothing we can do. We just gotta go as fast and as far as we can. And so he's skiing, and actually, Aimo was at the front of their formation, so he's actually leading the pack. And so really, it was his job to kind of create tracks in the snow that the others could follow in behind. It was easier for them, but it meant he was expending a lot of energy, basically pushing all the snow down as he was making his escape. And as much as he wanted to maintain that position and do this for his teammates, to continue to make tracks here, it was so exhausting. And also, like, when you're in combat, you have this unbelievable adrenaline rush that sometimes can lead to like a massive crash of energy. And it was like he had this huge rush of energy, and now it's like he's collapsing. Despite the need to escape here, it's like his body just cannot go any faster than he is going. And so before long, it's like he found himself slowing down, and his teammates are zipping by him cause they can't stop. The bullets are flying fast. Like, their only hope of survival is just to keep on going. And so Aimo knows that, like, basically, if he can't keep up, he's dead. But his body, it was just... He couldn't go any faster. He was slowing down, he was going slower and slower. He can hear the sound of the gunfire getting closer and closer. And he's thinking about his siblings and how devastated they're going to be to find out that he was killed in this war. And so slower and slower he's going. The sounds are getting louder and louder behind him. And he sees the last of his teammates pass him, and he sees them just kind of drift off down the mountain into the white abyss beyond, and they're gone. He's alone and he just can't keep up. And then finally, he just loses control of his skis. He veers off to the side. He starts stumbling down the mountain, smashes into a tree, and he passes out in the mountain. When Aimo woke up, it was light outside, but he had no idea how much time had passed. He also really had no idea how he was even still alive. Like what? Did the Soviets just decide not to kill me? Or did they not see me? Like, what happened to my teammates? Like, what's going on? He had a lot of questions. But, in addition to feeling confused about the whole situation, he also had this really distinct other feeling. He had this immense sense of being alert, like hyper alert, more than really he had ever been in his whole life. It's like he could hear and see everything at like a 10 times level. It's like, oh my God, I know everything going on around me. I'm totally aware. So, with his like hypervigilance that he suddenly was having, sort of out of nowhere, he began to, take stock of a situation. Right away he, was able to see that he's alone. Like, the Soviets are not nearby, he's not like being held captive. And again, his comrades are nowhere to be seen. So he's alone in the middle of the Arctic Circle, in the middle of the wilderness, which is quite bad. But he also could see that, okay, well, I still have my skis so I can still get around. He still had his boots on, he still had his equipment on. Like, he had the things he needed to survive. He even had his compass still, which had been in his hand, but he hadn't lost it. And so he had a way to navigate, and he had his weapons still. And so he's thinking, okay, the situation's bad, but I have what I need to survive for some time. And he also realized that, sort of amazingly, despite clearly crashing at a minimum and smashing into this tree that he was laying near, despite that, he didn't feel any pain in his body. And he didn't appear to have any injuries. So he's thinking, what a miracle here, that the worst thing that's happened here is I've basically been abandoned, I'm effectively lost. But it could be worse. And so, IMO, after taking stock of his situation, he stood up and just began looking all around him. And again, he has this hypervigilance thing going on, which he's thinking is, the product of a huge adrenaline rush from nearly dying. Maybe. But either way, he's hyper aware and he's looking around. And he notices off in the distance, maybe like 6 or 7 miles away, there's this mountain that immediately looks familiar to him. It looks like the mountain that he and his squadron had agreed would be their rendezvous point if they got separated. And so he's looking at it thinking that that's going to be it. And then he sees on this mountain, as he's kind of squinting and staring at this mountain, he sees what appears to be smoke coming off the mountain. And he's thinking, that's it, that's where my teammates have gone. Like, they haven't abandoned me, they've gone to the rendezvous point, they're going to wait for me. I just need to get to that mountain. I got my skis, I got my equipment, I don't think I'm hurt, I can do it. I'm going to get over there and I'll be safe. So IMO scooped up his backpack and picked up his gun and whatever other equipment he had on the ground. And then he started skiing towards this mountain. And for a while, he just kept on staring up at the smoke coming off the mountain, making sure he was going in the right direction. And as he got closer, he was nearly positive he could see that in addition to the smoke, he could see what appeared to be little lean-to tents on the mountainside, which were telltale signs that those were Finnish soldiers. That's how they set up their tents. So he's thinking, this is it, like, I'm gonna be saved, I just gotta get there. And he had so much energy maybe, because he was so close to being rescued or something. But he felt like this huge surge of energy. It was like nothing could make him tired. And then finally IMO got close enough to this campsite on the side of this mountain that he actually could see faces. He could see the other soldiers and they were his, Finnish comrades. They had clearly gone to the rendezvous point and they hadn't seen him yet. And so here he is, feeling like full of energy. He's barreling towards them and he starts calling out to them. He's thinking they're going to be like totally shocked that, anybody would just come out of the wilderness towards their campsite, let alone IMO, who they must have assumed by this point was dead. Also, he's thinking, I don't want them to shoot at me thinking I'm a Soviet soldier, so I better get their attention. And so he's yelling out for his comrades, and at some point, one of the men, they turn and they see IMO. And their reaction is not what IMO wanted. Their reaction was being really shocked, grabbing their weapon and shooting at him. And before long, all these soldiers, all of his comrades, are opening fire on IMO. And IMO's like, come on. Like, I'm one of you. What are you doing? But he's already going so fast, skiing so fast, that his only move was to basically ski right down the middle of their camp and just go to the other side of the mountain. And so he literally skied through this campsite with all of his comrades shooting at him, who miraculously missed him. So he doesn't get shot. Somehow the bullets whizzed past his head. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, they think I'm a Soviet. Come on, I'm calling out to you guys. I'm not a Soviet. But he barrels past them, and then after he's pretty far away from this campsite, he's yelling back to them like, guys, it's me. It's IMO. What are you doing? But they're yelling him, they're shooting in his direction. And so he had no choice but to just keep on skiing away from them, away from safety, or what he believed was going to be safety. And so on he went for hours and hours, just skiing and skiing away from this ambush, if you will. And the whole time he's thinking like, what happened? Even if they shot at me at first, couldn't they have figured it out that, like, I'm one of you? Like, wouldn't you have realized that eventually, as I skied right through your campsite, I have the same uniform as you, I have the same weapon as you recognize me. Like, what was that? And so he has no idea what happened, but he's like, how do I have so much energy? Like, how am I able to do this? I've been skiing for hours and hours and hours. I've been shot at so many times. Like, this is surreal. What's happening? Like, what is going on here? And so, Imo just continued skiing for hours and hours until it was abundantly clear he was not in shooting range. He didn't hear the sound of any gunfire. Like, he's safe again. Still very confused why this was even happening, but he's safe. You know, the sun's gone down, and so he thinks like, okay, I need to stop. I need to make camp. I need to regroup. But it was at this point that he's thinking to himself like, I haven't eaten anything, I haven't had any water. I've basically been at a full sprint, like skiing at a full sprint here, for basically practically the whole day. I've had multiple near-death experiences. I smashed into a tree during that initial, skirmish, but I feel great. I feel like I have more energy than I've ever had in my whole life. And so he's just caught by, how am I able to do this? Is this what it's like when you're in a true survival situation? Like, your body just goes into like overdrive or something. Like, he couldn't understand it. And so, he's standing there like, basically telling himself, you really need to stop. Even though you have the energy to go pretty much indefinitely, you need to stop. You need to make a fire, you need to have food, you need to have water, you need to rest. But it was like he was forcing himself to do these things. He didn't feel compelled to do them. It was like, oh, that's right, I need to like do human stuff. And so, that's what he did. He stopped, he built a fire, he made some food, and he's like not hungry at all, but he's eating the food, forcing himself to. He's having some water. And then he said, okay, I'll rest and then in the morning I'll figure out what to do next. But he lays down to go to sleep, and he should have been completely exhausted, but he wasn't. He couldn't even sleep, like, not at all. He just laid there completely wide awake as the wind and sleet and snow whipped all around him. And he just laid there again, feeling great but just not tired at all. The next morning when the sun came up, Imo had not slept at all, but still, he was able to get up, put his skis on and get his stuff and continue skiing, basically in the direction that he believed would bring him back to Finland. And as he was skiing, he's thinking to himself, it's kind of interesting, because when he first got attacked by the Soviets, it was like his mind was clear, but his body failed him. Like, his legs got so tired from trying to cut those tracks in the snow that he fell off and crashed, and that sort of lead him to this position. But now, for whatever reason, it was like his mind was delirious, like he couldn't keep his thoughts straight. But his body was like a Terminator, like he just kept on going no matter what. And so he just kept on skiing, almost like without even thinking. His body was like on autopilot. And so all day that day, Imo just skied in one direction and just didn't stop. And the whole time he's skiing, he didn't see another soul. He's out in the middle of, the Arctic Circle. There's no more Soviets. There's no more teammates. Nothing. He's just out in the middle of the wilderness. And realistically, he didn't know if he was even remotely going in the right direction, but he was just gonna go. But that night, as he's still just skiing in a straight line, not stopping, sort of unbelievably, he looked up ahead and he saw somebody. The first person he had seen since, the ambush at the campsite. And even more unbelievable is the person he saw was one of his teammates. It was this guy named Matty. He was a comrade of his. They had been together when the Soviets had first attacked. And so immediately, Imo's thinking like, clearly Matty got separated as well. And it's just serendipity that we have wound up at the same place. And so Imo, he skis right up to Matty and he's waving him down. He's so relieved to see him. And Matty, when he looks over at Imo, he doesn't shoot at him, but he sort of tells him to be quiet, calm down, and he kind of beckons him over. And when Imo comes up next to Matty, he has all these questions like, what do we do? Where are we going? But Matty just tells him just to be quiet and then gestures to lay down on the ground. And so Imo doesn't really know what's going on here, but he trusts Matty. Matty is not shooting at him. That was a good sign. And so the two of them just laid in the snow. They laid down right there, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Imo was able to feel tired enough that when he closed his eyes, he did drift off to sleep almost right away. When Ayamo woke back up again, he was not still lying down in the snow next to Maddie. He was instead standing up on his skis, skiing down a mountain like on a mission. Maddie's nowhere to be found. And on top of that, he didn't have his backpack and he didn't have his gun. He had no idea how long he'd been skiing for. He didn't know where he was going. It was like he went from passed out to skiing, just magically skiing. Now realistically, at this point Ayamo is thinking to himself, clearly what's happening here is I'm like hallucinating or something. Because how is it possible that I was just with Maddie, laying on the ground sleeping, and now I'm here? Like, it didn't add up. And so as he's just sort of mindlessly skiing along, he's like telling himself, like, this is you dying to himself. Like, this is you losing your mind before you die. Like, your mind is all over the place. Your body is still going for reasons he didn't really understand. Still at, full tilt, full energy. Didn't know why. But at some point, that's gonna give out and you're just gonna die. Like, that's what's gonna happen here. And so, Ayamo's only hope was that between now and when he died, that hopefully somebody would see him and save him. He knew it was an outside chance, but at this point, that's all he had. And so on he skied, no weapon, no backpack, no supplies. He's basically operating on no sleep, and he's just skiing. And for days and days, he doesn't stop. He can't believe his body is keeping up as well as it is. His mind is like totally gone, but he is just going for days and days and days and days and days. Doesn't run into anyone, but then one day again, days later, he's skiing along and magically, almost in front of him, appears this building. He can't tell if it's necessarily a military outpost or civilian. He doesn't know if it's Finnish or German or Soviet. But he knows, even in his totally fractured mental state, that attempting to go in that building and hoping there are people in there that will save him, even if they won't, even if they kill him, maybe that is a better outcome, a better choice than doing what he's doing right now, which is the sort of endless ski to his death. And so Ayamo starts skiing faster and faster towards this building, just like full reckless abandon, fully committed to, this is my rescue or this is my death. And as he gets closer, he sees sort of unbelievably that this is a military installation, and it is a German military installation. And remember, the Finnish are allied with the Germans at this point, and so this is a safe place for him. And so he's so relieved, he can't believe he's gonna potentially survive this thing. He takes off his skis and he starts running towards the front door of this building. But before he gets to the front door, he steps on something and then there was a loud bang, and he's thrown into the air and comes crashing down. And when Ayamo opened his eyes and sort of took stock of what had happened, he didn't feel any pain. But he looked down and he saw his foot was just a bloody mess. There was literally bones poking out of his ankle. Like he could see clearly he sustained a horrible injury and he must have just stepped on a landmine. But Ayamo, determined to get into that building, he pulled himself up again, sort of channeling this unbelievable just endurance he had been feeling the past several days that he had been out here. He stood up and on one foot began hobbling his way towards this installation. And he finally gets to the front door of this German military base, and he grabs the doorknob and he's about to open it, when there's another banging sound and he's thrown again into the air. He had stepped on another landmine and he comes smashing down. And he doesn't die, he doesn't feel any pain. But he looks down at his legs and he sees his other leg that was not injured a minute ago is now also mangled. So now he can't even stand, he's incapacitated. And on top of that, even though he's near this military outpost, he turns and looks at it, and now that he's a little bit closer and he's sort of looking more intentionally at this building, he realizes it's abandoned. Like, this isn't gonna save him. He's trapped. He's in the middle of nowhere and there's no one here, Ard. And so at this point, Ayamo just said, you know what just said? It's over. Like, I'm gonna die. And so he literally just crawled his way over to this nearby ditch, let himself roll into it, and he just waited to die. He just knew it was over, but he didn't die for days. He just laid in this ditch, like unable to die. He wanted to die, he wanted this to be over. Like, what else is he gonna do? Who's gonna save him? But he just watched the sun come up and set, go up, set, over and over and over. He lost track of how many days he was just laying there, again bleeding profusely, like grievously injured. He hasn't eaten anything. He hasn't had any water. He can't believe he's still alive. He really can't believe it. And for days and days, Imo just laid in this ditch fully awake, fully alert, like just completely alive. It was like he wanted to die. He wanted his body to shut down and just have this end, but it's like his body wouldn't. It was still in this super intense, like hyper-survival mode where his mind was a mess, but his body was just like full stay alive no matter what mode. And so he's just laying there like wondering, when is this gonna finally end? And it just wouldn't. Like days and days are going by. And then as he's laying there, one of these days he's just in this ditch. He looks up during the daytime and he sees what looks like a plane flying overhead. Now at this point, Imo is in very bad shape. I mean, he's alive, but it's not going well, and he knows that. He knows that, So he doesn't know if he's hallucinating this or what, but he felt like it was real. But after watching this plane circle overhead for a minute, Imo was certain he heard the sound of this plane landing nearby. And then a couple of minutes later, he could have sworn from the ditch, he can't really see anything. He could hear the sound of people speaking in Finnish, his native language. And then a moment later, again he didn't know if he was hallucinating or not, but he sees this head poke over the top of the ditch. And it was this young man, this young Finnish guy, and he's looking down at Imo, and Imo's looking back up at him. And then a second later, Imo was being pulled out of the ditch. Later that day, Imo found himself laying in a hospital bed inside of a hospital in Finland. Like the man in the plane. All that, not a hallucination. He really had been rescued. And once he was at the hospital, it turned out he weighed just 94 pounds. He was also badly burned and frostbitten, and both of his legs were very badly mutilated and mangled. And his heart was beating at a staggering 200 beats per minute, despite the fact he's just laying in bed not doing anything. And even more crazy was they couldn't actually get his heart to slow down. It just kept beating at this crazy high level. Now at first, doctors and nurses and all the staff were really shocked by Imo's condition. Not really just that he had survived, but again his heart rate, it just seemed like, dude, how are you alive right now? Your heart can't beat at this level for this long without eventually killing you. But after they spoke to Imo and had him recount the whole ordeal of him being out, getting shot at and lost in the whole thing, they learned one really specific thing that explained the whole thing. When Imo and his, Finnish comrades were initially ambushed by the Soviet soldiers, they decided to flee. But Imo, he was having such a hard time physically keeping up with the other soldiers, he was just getting so tired from trying to break the tracks. And then he fell. Often he's thinking to himself, if I don't find a way to keep up, I'm gonna get captured or get killed by the Soviets. And so he's desperate. And so, before he ultimately crashed down the side of the mountain from exhaustion, he tried something to try to give himself some energy, to try to make this escape. He pulled out these special military rations that he had been issued along with everybody else in his squadron. They were all given these rations, and the reason you take these rations is to give yourself some energy. And so he takes these rations and he's thinking, this is going to do it. This is going to give me the boost I need to get out of here and make the escape with my teammates. But the rations didn't work, and so he did sort of completely fall off. He was so tired to the point where he literally tumbled down the side of the mountain. His teammates, they skied off, and he smashed into a tree and he passes out. However, when Imo woke up, he was amazed he had not been captured or killed by the Soviets. But he's realizing he's all alone and what's gonna happen to me? And then he starts to feel man, I just have a lot of energy. I can see and perceive things on a level that I couldn't before. Well, that's because the military rations had kicked in, and now he have this abundance of energy. And it allowed him to basically ski indefinitely without sleeping, without having water, without food. He gets blown up twice, his feet have been blown off basically. He's laying in a ditch dying, but he just can't seem to die. I mean, the guy should have died like several times, but these rations did their job. They gave him all the energy he needed to survive this crazy 2 weeks in the wild. Well, the military rations, they're called Pervidin. And this drug, I don't know if it's still given to soldiers now, but probably not, because effectively what Pervidin is just pure crystal meth. And so in essence, Imo survived in the wild for all this time because he was on just a pure meth-fueled rage. He was just completely high for 2 weeks, and it saved his life. One thing to note about Pervidin is it does have two distinct downsides. 1, it is incredibly addictive, and 2, it creates really intense hallucinations. And so very likely he did not come across his own battalion, who then opened fire on him. He did not come across Maddie, his teammate out in the wild, who told him to lay down. And who knows, we're not even sure if the military installation he saw was real. Very likely all of that was just in his mind. However, the landmines, those were real. Somewhat unbelievably, Imo would make a full recovery and he would go on to get married. He would have 9 children, and he would live to the age of 71. And as grateful as he was to the drug that did save his life, he never took Pervidin again. One day in January of 2018, a police officer walked through the woods near the small town of Gray, France. And as he walked, he was looking at the ground because he was following a literal trail of blood. And this trail eventually led the officer to the body of a person who clearly had been shot in the head. Now, this appeared to be a suicide, but the police officer had some questions because this was not the first body that had been found in these woods near the small town in France. Another body had been found a couple of months earlier, and it was starting to seem like there was a pattern here. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you make coffee, for the follow button, don't use a coffee filter. So there's just a ton of grinds in their drink. Okay, let's get into today's story. At around 5:00 p.m. on the evening of October 27, 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Dovel drove her car down a cul-de-sac in the small, quiet town of Gray, France. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's 2nd birthday, and it was going to be this big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had come in all the way from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away. But Alexia, realistically, had mixed feelings about seeing them all tonight. So, Alexia had been going through a pretty hard time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan N., had been trying to get pregnant, and so she'd done several rounds of fertility treatments, which had thrown her hormones completely out of whack and seemed to affect her a lot more than was typical for most women. And then finally, when all that had led to her actually getting pregnant, she unfortunately had miscarried just a couple of months ago. And so, even though Alexia loved her sister's family and got along with them really well, her miscarriage was still really fresh in her mind. And she just knew it was going to be very difficult for her to be around her young nephew. It was just a reminder of what she had lost. Now, Alexia came to a stop outside of a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac, and she rang the intercom. And then, when the gate opened up, she drove up the driveway toward a nice house with a very well-kept garden. She parked her car in the driveway behind her father's white van and then got out of her car. She grabbed a wrapped present out of the back seat, along with a couple of desserts that she'd made, carried them up to the house, and rang the doorbell. And a few seconds later, her mother, Isabelle Foulot, answered the door with a big smile and led her into the dining room where Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, sat at the table talking with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and also her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and they greeted her. And then, as Alexia began to explain that her husband, Jonathan N., was running late and he'd be here later in a separate car because the job he'd been working that day as an electrician had run long, as she was saying all that, Alexia heard the sound of little feet making their way towards her turn. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his arms around Alexia's legs. And surprisingly to Alexia's relief, she didn't feel sadness. All she felt was happiness. And so, she bent down and scooped him up and gave the boy a big hug. And then she also handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the group settled in for dinner, and for a while, all of Alexia's worries just kind of faded away. She was really close with everybody at the table, especially her mother and her sister, Stephanie, and being around them always put her in a good mood. Alexia's husband, Jonathan N., finally arrived sometime around 8:30, and he, along with the rest of the group, had a wonderful night eating and drinking and drinking and drinking and chatting. After dinner was cleaned up, Alexia's father did go to bed, but everybody else stayed up and they all just continued having this nice time until around 11:00 p.m. when Alexia said it was really time for her and Jonathan N. to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan N. had some errands to run in the morning, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in. A few minutes later on the doctor home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan N.'s car. She left her own car at her parents' house because she'd been drinking, and she was planning to pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan N.'s house was on a quiet residential street, only about a mile away from Alexia's parents' house. And as they made their way down the road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house that was just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, she frowned. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer. He'd been obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't feel safe even going out for a jog around the block when she was by herself. Now, fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't really know how long it would be until he got out again, or if he'd already been released, she didn't know. So it just sort of felt like a reprieve, not a long-term solution. But on this night, at least there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage and Alexia and Jonathan N. got out. And as Alexia went from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill in the corner of the garage, which had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan N. if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he said no. Alexia just sighed. It was supposed to be a very cold and gloomy morning the next day, and so it looked like she was going to have to run outside. The following morning around 11:00 a.m., Jonathan N. walked up to the door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. And as he did, he sort of gave a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked where they left it the night before. Jonathan N. took a deep breath and tried not to show how anxious he felt as Alexia's mother, Isabel, answered the door. And then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan N. said hello and asked her if she'd seen or heard from her daughter recently. And when Isabel said she had not, Jonathan N. completely lost his composure. He said that morning Alexia had gone out for a jog but not come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered, and by this point, she should have been home a long time ago, so something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan N. saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room with very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan N. and Isabel at the front door and asked what the commotion was about. And so, Jonathan N. sort of frantically explained the situation and asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so, but they shook their heads and said they hadn't. But Stephanie showed Jonathan N. that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning, just to say that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from Alexia. Jonathan N. was crying at this point, and so Alexia's family tried to assure him that, Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute here. Like nothing's going on, I'm sure she's just running late. And Jonathan N., he wanted to believe this, but this was completely unusual. Like, this was not normal for Alexia to be gone for this long without being in touch. It just didn't make sense. It was at this point that Jonathan N.'s brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put his hand on Jonathan N. in a sort of comforting way and just said, "Look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you. And we can literally go look for Alexia together, or at least be together, until she comes back." Jonathan N. didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful and said, "Yep, that would be great." And so a couple of minutes later, the two men got in Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan N. actually navigated him through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could find her. They drove down all the side streets looking for her, and then when they reached the edge of town, Jonathan N. and Gregory got out of the car and began checking the paths leading into the countryside and also the ditches in the banks of the river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. And then eventually, they just drove back to Jonathan N. and Alexia's house to see if maybe she'd finally come home with an explanation for all this. But she had not come home. At this point, Jonathan N. was completely beside himself, and so Gregory, doing his best to stay calm, said, "You know what to him. Let's go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there." A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan N. jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance where two nurses were taking a cigarette break. Jonathan N. told these nurses that he was here looking for his wife and that she'd gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now. And maybe she's here. So the nurses, who could clearly tell this was an emergency, they put out their cigarettes and went inside to check the register. But a minute later, they came back and told the men that no, Alexia Dovell had not been admitted that morning. She was not here. Before Jonathan N. or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just said, "Look, you gotta go to the police." Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline Poe sat across from Jonathan N. in a room at the Great Police Station as he explained what had happened with his wife, that she was about to name Marta's wife, Missy. Jonathan N. also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running: bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket. So, pretty easy to spot. And then after describing her and sort of realizing the weight of what he was here for, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, as he had been doing much of the morning. Now, Poe could obviously tell that Jonathan N. was very upset here, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan N. if his wife had any suicidal tendencies or any reason she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan N. looked up really quickly and just shook his head and said no, and said that overall his wife was very happy and definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he said she had been taking hormones for fertility, and realistically those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. Or in other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses where she wouldn't even know what she was doing when she was doing it. It was like she had become this different person. Poe nodded and just listened to Jonathan N. and wrote down everything he was saying. And then when he was done, she followed up and said, "You know, can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia?" And for a moment, Jonathan N. just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question, and then suddenly his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told Poe that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arnaud and he'd been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number and had actually talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan N. said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan N. said he could be home now. "I just don't know. I don't know where he is." Poe was obviously very intrigued by this. And so, after this interview was over with Jonathan N., she and her investigative team began digging into this Arnaud guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly, they discovered that while Arnaud had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true, he was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Grey Police knocked on the door of Arnaud's mother's house where Arnaud was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan N.'s house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door, and when the officer asked if she was Arnaud's mother, she said she was Arnaud's mother. The officer looked past her, and he could see there was this disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. And he asked the mother if that was or no. And again, the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arnaud in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute, they both agreed and the officer came inside. And so the officer went inside the house and sat down in the living room with Arnaud, while Arnaud's mother went to the kitchen to give the men some privacy. And then once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arnaud and just said he had some questions about Alexia Dovel. Arnaud immediately looked down at this question like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. Then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder, and sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, including Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that apparently Arnaud had sent to Alexia that summer, like what was going on with that. And Arnaud admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point, and they'd also hung out in a group setting once, and so him being in touch with her was not totally weird. Like, they had a real connection. But Arnaud clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did, and that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention, because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan M., the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arnaud's phone number. So the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arnaud that Alexia was missing. And then before Arnaud could say anything, the officer asked him where he'd been that morning at 9:00 a.m. And Arnaud said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arnaud, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive or not. So eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was, and he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer with sort of a bewildered look on her face that he was here with me all morning. And so, at this point, it was clear to the officer that, if the mother was telling the truth here, it would officially rule out Arnaud as a suspect because, he was here. But the officer also knew that generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis because mothers are known to lie, cheat, steal, and do anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Paradis glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Paradis, who was in charge of the investigation. Now, it was still early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every step. Paradis closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and the surrounding woods. Paradis' investigation team had also searched Jonathan N. and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan N. But there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They claimed they had all been at the house together. And so, without any real leads, Paradis had gotten so desperate for any information that he literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Paradis sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door, and a moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints actually had turned up something. Paradis listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he'd spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor, that apparently there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Paredes was worried that perhaps this was just like an unfounded rumor. But then he remembered there were actually 2 men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one, and her husband, Jonathan N., he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, so a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Paredes brought his car to a stop next to a news van parked in the middle of the woods, about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so, Paredes had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that Paredes was here at the crime scene, he could tell obviously he was late to the game because, a news crew was already here setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. And Paredes was disappointed to see this, because he'd hoped that if and when her body was discovered, if she was found dead at that time, he would have had at least one suspect, or hopefully multiple suspects, identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now, he obviously would not get that chance. Paredes sighed, climbed out of his car, and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. Paredes approached one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers around on the ground, and Paredes introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between the tree trunks, covered by a white bed sheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Paredes noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Paredes bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face, and there were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Paredes noticed a couple of things that were unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face. And so, to Paredes, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Paredes think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia, and not a stranger who simply, accosted her during a jog. Just then, Paredes heard somebody call his name and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensic tech that was waving him over, and so Paredes walked over and the tech showed Paredes what he had just found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can, and Paredes thought, maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensic tech called Paredes over to them to show him something else. They had found tire tracks in the dirt. Paredes immediately thought about that tip that he had been given about this van with this person driving around town harassing women and girls. And he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved and that these had been left by the killer when they weren't transporting Alexia's body. And so, as this forensic expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Paredes made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other persons of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. And so, Paredes was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing. Out in the woods, there was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the tree, almost lurking near the crime scene. And so immediately, Paredes went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing here. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering, like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out here picking mushrooms, but Paredes could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out here. And so, operating on sort of a gut instinct, Paredes pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods outside of town, Paredes sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he just arrested for lurking near the crime scene for no clear reason. And Paredes was pleased. I mean, he'd only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really like the first suspect who was in custody. But as soon as Paredes actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away, and he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. And so, Paredes pressed Anthony to explain then why he was there, and Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain, but what he said was he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he had not been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he'd just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up, and clearly there was something going on. And when Paredes walked over to him, Anthony said he got scared and just lied and said, "Oh, I'm out here picking mushrooms." Like he said it was just embarrassment. And as Paredes sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So, Paredes followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he'd woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Paredes their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Paredes stepped out of the room and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So, despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Paredes had no choice but to let Anthony go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. And hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who'd been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan N. Duvall. At this point, Jonathan N. really was looking like the most obvious suspect since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So, the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan N. made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings, and his friends to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan N. around found that he really rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. But so far, it was like none of Jonathan N.'s behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan N. hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. And in fact, Jonathan N. was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan N. was like a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but, watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan N. and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Paredes, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then, all of a sudden, new evidence did appear, and when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time because while they'd been focused on surveilling Jonathan N., A second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, January 6, 2018, Chief Officer Paredes was at his desk poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head, although according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. I mean, that can be fatal on its own, or at the very least knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now they were reading his death as a suicide. But the more Paredes looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide because, a gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be he shot himself and then put the gun in the trash can and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head typically is immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel the 130 feet. It just seemed very unlikely. So now Paredes sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have 2 violent deaths in the same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found basically in the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Paredes scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore, because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Paredes felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading, and a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called a supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer. This is how police believe Alexia Davo was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they, lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. And so the killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up, but it was too late. She was dead. And so, now they're really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees, where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help, dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan N. It turns out Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before after she and Jonathan N. had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan N. and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple, but in reality, they'd been arguing more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so, on the night of October 27, in the middle of this horrible fight they're having, Jonathan N. grabbed his keys and tried to leave. But Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan N., that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan N. was arrested on January 28, 2018, and 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that make you realize not everything is as it seems. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called On the Prowl, and it's about a local urban legend that quickly turns into a full-blown nightmare. The second story you'll hear is called Call Your Mother, and it's about a mother who is devastated after her son disappears. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Red Ghost, and it's about this horrifying creature that terrorized people for years on the Arizona frontier. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to come on an all-expenses-paid trip to Venice, Italy with you, but the second you're both in a gondola, push them into a canal. Okay, let's get into our first story called On the Prowl. On the night of October 20th, 2021, 2 young couples were hanging out inside of a little home in the woods in Henderson County, North Carolina. The couples were Rachel and her fiancé, Chris, and their friends, Autumn and Jake, whose home it was. Rachel and Autumn were in the kitchen, preparing to dye Rachel's hair over the sink. Jake and Chris were in the living room, discussing the very strange sightings of a black panther that had been reported all over town in recent days. So, North Carolina does have big cats, including panthers. After all, their professional football team is named the Carolina Panthers. However, the panthers in North Carolina are typically of the brownish color, not the pitch black variety, like the panther that was apparently prowling all over Henderson County in recent days. Nonetheless, Chris was absolutely convinced that he had seen this black panther about a week ago when he was out walking his Rachel's new puppy. He swore the panther had been following him in the tree line around his property, and he had been afraid it was thinking about attacking his dog ever since. He told Jake he'd been nervous walking around his property outside, and so he'd begun to carry a gun for protection. Jake was in the middle of telling Chris that he, too, was now carrying a gun around for the same reason when they were interrupted by Rachel calling for Chris from the kitchen. Jake and Chris got up off the couch and walked into the kitchen, where Rachel told them that she'd been trying to show Autumn a YouTube video about how to dye hair at home when her phone had died. And so, she asked Chris if he wouldn't mind going back to their apartment and getting her a phone charger. Now obviously, Chris was not thrilled about going into the woods at night, with this panther roaming around. But he loved his fiancée and would do anything for her, and he had his gun, so he said he would go. And as Chris headed to the door to leave, Jake said, "Hold on a minute." He grabbed his flashlight and grabbed his gun and told Chris he would tag along and watch his buddies back. The 2 guys said they'd be back in a minute, and then they walked out the door. A light wind rustled the leaves of the trees as Jake and Chris set out on the little path that connected their 2 homes. They both stayed absolutely quiet as they walked, because they wanted to make sure they could hear any indication of this panther being nearby. But all they could hear was the wind, some crickets, and an owl hooting in the distance. But about halfway down the path, Chris suddenly heard something coming from the woods and instinctively shot out his hand to stop Jake in his tracks. They both froze, and then Jake raised his flashlight and shined it at the underbrush where Chris was saying he had heard noise. And for a second, all they saw were green leaves. But then, 2 eyes opened up and reflected back at them. The 2 men gasped and instinctively reached for their guns, but before they had to draw and do anything, this creature emerged from the underbrush, and it was just a raccoon. Chris and Jake laughed in relief and then continued walking down the path to Chris's house. They went inside, got Rachel's charger, and then they left and stepped back into the woods. But now, as Chris and Jake walked along this dark path, something just felt different. The crickets seemed to have gotten quieter, and the wind had picked up. The owl that had been hooting before must have flown away, because it was now strangely quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the wind in the trees. They were about 40 feet away from Jake's house when they suddenly heard a twig snap to their left. And so, the two men turned to face the noise, and as they did, they heard another sound, a low, raspy growl. And so, Jake aimed his flashlight at the bush where these noises had come from, and this time it was obvious it was not a raccoon, because the bushes were literally shaking like some enormous animal was inside of them. And so, the two men looked at each other with wide eyes, and without saying a word, they both knew they were thinking the same thing. It's the panther. And so, the two men drew their guns and they aimed it at the bush, hoping that this thing would just take off back into the woods. But it didn't. The bush continued to shake like whatever it was going to leap out, and so the men just opened fire. And they kept on shooting until they heard a new, horrible sound, and the second they heard it, they dropped their guns. It would turn out that was not a panther. After Chris and Jake had left the house, Rachel and Autumn decided to pull a prank. They had found some expired eggs in the fridge, and they had decided they would go hide in the bushes near the pathway and pelt the guys with them. When Rachel saw Chris and Jake approaching, she tried to crouch down lower in the bush so as not to be seen. But as she did, she stepped on a twig, and at the same time, in anticipation of their prank, the women started to laugh. They tried to stifle their laughter, but that only made them snort and shake the bushes. And that combination of noises, the snapped twig, the stifled laughter which sort of resembled a short, raspy growl, and the shaking bushes signaled to the guys that this was no prank. This was the panther, and if they didn't act, it might attack them. And so they drew their guns and they began to shoot until they heard Autumn scream out in horror. Tragically, by the time they had stopped shooting, it was already too late for Rachel. She had been shot to death. Law enforcement did an investigation into the shooting, and they declared it was just a horrible accident. Everybody was sober, and the two men were carrying their weapons legally, and so no one was ever charged with Rachel's death. And to this day, no one has ever gotten solid evidence that that Black Panther even exists. Our next story is called Call Your Mother. On the morning of September 15th, 2016, an 80-year-old widow named Rita Wolfen's son shuffled her way into her kitchen inside of a brick home in Brooklyn, New York. However, Rita was basically blind, and as she made her way into the kitchen, she walked past her Abel and her for caught a basket of newspapers on the ground, and it caused her to stumble and fall to the floor. And the second she hit the ground, she heard a pop. And the second she heard that pop, she felt a shooting pain in her hip, and she knew right away, very likely, her hip was broken. Now, of course, this is a huge problem if you break your hip, but for Rita in particular, this was a very, very serious problem. I mean, this was potentially life and death, and she knew it. And she also knew the reason this was so serious was all her fault. Rita lived completely alone and basically had cut off everybody in her life for like 20 years. She had not interacted with virtually anybody in her life by choice. And basically, the reason for this all started 20 years earlier with her beloved son, Louis, who lived with her. But for some reason 20 years ago, so basically right at the time when she cut off her whole family and all her friends, her son Louis just kind of inexplicably packed up and left her house without saying anything. And then she never heard from him again. And so, suddenly losing her son for reasons unknown sent Rita into this spiraling depression. And the way she coped with it was basically cutting off the entire world around her, and she just lived in this house totally isolated, totally alone. And so now here she is, stuck on the kitchen floor with a broken hip, unable to get up or call for help. And nobody is going to come by to help her. Nobody even knows she's in trouble. She's all alone. But despite basically being blind and knowing she's in this horrible situation, somewhere deep down, Rita finds this inner strength. She knows that if she's gonna survive this, she has to save herself, and so she kind of rolled over onto her other side, despite the pain in her hip throbbing the whole time. She got herself onto her elbows, and she began low crawling her way towards the coffee table in the living room that was right near the kitchen. And she finally got over there, The whole time she's got this horrible pain on her side, gets to the table, she reaches up and she grabs her phone, which she basically never used because she didn't talk to anybody or take any phone calls. But she managed to get the receiver off the cradle, then she dialed 91111. And so a few minutes later, the ambulance arrives at Rita's house. They come in, they find Rita, She's still on the ground. They scoop her up, they put her in the ambulance, and they go to the hospital. And when they get there, very quickly, they put Rita through a bunch of scans and tests, and they confirmed, what Rita was already expecting, which is, her hip is broken. However, after telling her about the fact that her hip was broken, the nurses and doctors told Rita that, you're going to have to stay here for surgery. But then after you get out of surgery, you can't just go home. You're legally blind, you're very frail, and you don't live with anyone. And you nearly died from falling on your kitchen floor, because had you not been able to reach your phone, you would have starved to death. And so they told Rita that what she would need to do is move into an assisted living home where basically nurses and a medical team would be able to care for her on a day-to-day basis. Basically, she wasn't going to be allowed to move back into her beloved home where she had spent her whole life. And for Rita, this news was just unbelievably devastating. I mean, not only because that was her home, that's where she spent all her time, but also because it was the last place she had been before Louis had left inexplicably. I mean, 20 years later, she's still dealing with the trauma of losing her son, and that house was kind of like the last memory of her son. I mean, his bedroom had basically been untouched since he left, because she was so holding on to his memory. And so, after the nurses and doctors left, Rita was left in the room all alone, kind of unsure what to do. And it dawned on her she would need to do something that for 20 years she had completely avoided doing. She would need to call her family. So, she grabbed the phone and she still remembered the number of her younger brother, Joseph. And so she called Joseph up. Now, the reason she called Joseph is, over the past 20 years, the one family member who had basically tried really hard to stay in touch with Rita after she cut everybody off was Joseph. And so she figured if there was anybody in her family who would not judge her for the silence and, being cut off, it would be Joseph. And so a couple of seconds later, a phone rang inside of a house pretty far away from the hospital, but still in New York. And this was Joseph's house, and he was sitting on the couch reading a book, and his wife was in the kitchen doing her thing. And Joseph, he answers the phone, and when he hears Rita's voice, he couldn't believe it. He was shocked to hear her after so many years. But immediately, the feeling he had was relief. He and his sister before Louis had left and kind of destroyed Rita's life, Joseph and his older sister had been very close, and it had really broken his heart when Rita had cut him off. I mean, he felt like if there was one person that Rita would have stayed in touch with, it would have been him. But he didn't judge her. He was ready to hear whatever she had to say because obviously, something big had to have happened for her to call him. And so he asked her, what's going on? What's going on? And Rita would explain, she fell and she needs help. And Joseph was like, I will be there as soon as I possibly can. And also, I'll have my wife swing by your house to grab, your toothbrush and some toiletries, and a couple of things from home to make your stay at the hospital a bit better. But we're gonna get through this. I'll be there as soon as I can. A few hours later, as Joseph was making his way to the hospital to see Rita, Joseph's wife was on her way to Rita's house to pick up her things. So she pulled up in front of the house and she looked up at the big brick house. And it looked the same as it had, 10, 20 years ago. She made her way up to the door. She didn't knock because she knew nobody was home. And so she used the key that Joseph gave her. She unlocked the door, she opened it up, and immediately she was hit with this horrible smell. So Rita was basically a hoarder, and so she had lots of, plates of food and all this stuff just kind of jammed inside of her house, and it was all rotting. And so her house really smelled horrible, not to mention Rita basically never went outside. Remember, she kind of was a hermit for the past 20 years, and so Joseph's wife was kind of bracing for a pretty disgusting living situation. But this was far more repulsive than even she had braced for. But she knew she had a job to do, get in there and get some things for Rita. And so she kind of began breathing through her mouth only to avoid the smell. And so she stepped into the house, which again, was piled high on either side of the hallway with newspapers and just kind of junk. So she began walking through the house, and she eventually turned toward a flight of stairs. She went up to the second floor, and the second floor is the same as the first floor. There's plates of food and junk and all this stuff. And she didn't know which bedroom was Rita's, so she just went to the first door that she saw. Then she opened it up, kind of hoping that maybe this would be Rita's bedroom. But the second she opened up that door, not only was she hit with more horrible smells, but she saw something in this room that she was not braced for, something that terrified her to the point where she shut the door, turned around, and sprinted out of the house, practically screaming. And then as soon as she was outside, she dialed 911. It would turn out Rita's understanding of what actually transpired 20 years earlier with Louis inexplicably leaving. The event that basically caused Rita to shut down and cut her whole family off, her understanding of that was totally wrong. Rita had always believed that her son had just kind of stopped loving her or didn't like her anymore or something, like there was some sort of falling out. And that's why he just kind of packed up his stuff and left without even saying goodbye. But that wasn't true. Louis loved his mother. He didn't just randomly abandon her, but 20 years earlier, when Louis was 29 years old, while he was still living with Rita in her house, he died somewhat unexpectedly from natural causes. It's believed he had some sort of terminal illness that he may or may not have known about. And it's unclear if he even communicated that he was sick or that he had this illness to his mom. And so 20 years earlier, he went into his bedroom one night and he passed away in his bed. And his mother, Rita, instead of going into his bedroom and checking on him, just didn't go into his bedroom, and instead convinced herself that her son must have abandoned her because he didn't love her anymore, and it sent her into the spiraling depression, and she cut off her whole family, when in reality, Louis had never left her house, was still laying in his bed upstairs all those 20 years. And so when Joseph's wife went into Rita's house and went into that first bedroom she saw on the second floor, what she saw was Louis's skeleton, still wearing a shirt and pants, laying in his bed, obviously deceased. And that's why she went running out of the house and called 911. And so, in a very bizarre and morbid way, it was this discovery by Joseph's wife that would ultimately bring Rita back together again with her family. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Red Ghost. On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse, along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. Their husbands herded the sheep and worked the land, while Sarah and Elizabeth looked after the house and also took care of their collective for kids. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, Sarah continued to tidy up the house with one eye on the kids, making sure they were okay, when all of a sudden the family's dogs who were leashed up outside began barking really aggressively. Now for Sarah, this was really alarming because the dogs typically were pretty docile and didn't make a lot of noise, so clearly something was going on outside. And so Sarah told the kids to stay inside, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. And so once Sarah was out on that porch, she immediately surveyed the area out in front of her. And off to her left and off to her right was just rocky scrubland. And then right in front of their house was this big sandy hill that kind of obscured their view off into the distance. And the dogs, who were leashed up right in front of the property out in the front yard, they were all looking right at that hill and barking at it. At first, Sarah couldn't understand what the dogs were even barking at. I mean, she looked around a few more times to see if she was missing anything, but there was nothing happening out here. But then, as Sarah continued to stare at this hill where the dogs were still barking, she suddenly saw this huge creature emerge over the top and begin coming down the hill in her direction. It was this massive four-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up. And on the back of this creature was this man, except it was not a normal-looking man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. And as she stared at him in total shock and disbelief, she saw he was missing eyes. Now Sarah was a deeply religious person, and so as she's watching this creature being ridden on by this person come charging towards her, all she could think was, this is the devil. The devil is riding on this red creature, and it's coming to get me and my family. And so instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen huddled over them, praying to God to save them from the devil. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside, and she knew it sounded way too human of a scream to be coming from the devil or the creature it was riding on. And then she remembered her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister. But Sarah was so scared she couldn't move, and she had these 4 kids to look after her. And so, instead of going out to try to save her sister, she just held the kids closer and continued to pray, hoping her sister would survive. Hours later, Sarah was still inside the barricaded house, clutching the children, praying, and her sister Elizabeth had not made another sound, and she had not come back to the house. So she's been gone for hours at this point, and Sarah feels horrible. All she wants to do is go out there and find her sister, but she just feels like she can't leave her kids, and she knows the devil is out there, so she can't go out there. But just then, she hears footsteps out on the porch, and then she hears the sound of the doorknob turning and then bumping up against the barricade. And Sarah immediately thinks it's the devil's come back. And so she screams and the kids are screaming. But then, on the other side of the door, Sarah hears the sound of 2 familiar voices. It was the sound of her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep, and they're calling into her like, "Hey, what's going on here? Let us in." And so this huge wave of relief came over Sarah. She rushed to the door, she got rid of the barricade, flung it open, and immediately began sobbing and telling these men about what had happened, about the devil, about hearing that scream which she believed was Elizabeth. And oh, by the way, Elizabeth is still not back yet. No idea what happened to her. And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. So the 2 men, they grab their guns and lanterns and they head off towards the outdoor spring to hopefully find Elizabeth. And so the 2 men, they began making their way down this path towards the spring. And at first, they were walking, keeping their composure, but quickly, as they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth, and she was face down on the ground with blood all around her. She was dead. And so, as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate to see what happened to Elizabeth. The only thing that seemed fairly obvious about Elizabeth's death, at least to the 2 husbands, was that Elizabeth looked like she had been trampled to death. There were all these hoof prints all around her when they found her. And so the coroner, he comes out and he looks at the scene, he sees Elizabeth, and he agrees that it looks like she was trampled to death. However, when he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. And so the coroner literally said, "I can't say she died by being trampled by a horse. This was not a horse." And so the coroner wound up speaking to Sarah, who would tell him all about, how the devil came over the hill on this big 4-legged creature that was all red, and she heard the scream which must have been Elizabeth. And so the devil has trampled her sister to death. That's what happened. Now, the coroner agreed with Sarah that very likely her sister had been trampled to death by something gigantic. However, he didn't believe the actual details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the devil killed Elizabeth. And so, ultimately, because the coroner just couldn't be sure what actually happened here, he wound up listing Elizabeth's cause of death as just unknown. But the coroner's doubts did not stop the story of the devil from spreading. Before long, basically everybody on the Arizona frontier heard about the devil and the strange creature he rode, to the point where they were given a nickname together. They were called the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard the story didn't really believe it actually happened. They figured it was kind of a joke, or maybe an exaggeration, just sort of lore passed around town. But over the next few years following Elizabeth's death, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent and more strange. Many campers claimed to have seen the Red Ghost trotting through the Arizona wilderness. In fact, some of these people claim that in the middle of the night, the Red Ghost would appear and trample on their tents. One cowboy claimed he got close enough to the Red Ghost that he was able to actually lasso its neck. However, the Red Ghost in turn took off so quickly and so powerfully that the cowboy got dragged and had to let go. And so stories like these, run-ins with the Red Ghost out in the wild, persisted for years until about a decade after Elizabeth's death. This farmer in eastern Arizona happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called Red Ghost. And this farmer had heard all the stories about the Red Ghost, and he had already made up his mind about what he would do if he ever ran into the Red Ghost, and that would be to shoot it. And so, what did he do? He grabbed his rifle, he leaned out the window, and he fired. The Red Ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once the creature was down, the farmer rushed outside and ran up to the carcass to finally see what the heck the Red Ghost was. What was causing all these stories to spread over so many years? And when he got out there and actually looked down at the Red Ghost, he knew immediately that all the stories about this creature had been wrong. It would turn out the Red Ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the Red Ghost was a combination of two very mortal beings. The first of these two beings was a creature that, if you saw it today, you would know what it was. But for folks in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have no way of knowing what this creature was. They had never seen it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humpback. It was a camel. It had been brought to the United States from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies through the western frontier, and it had escaped captivity. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the Red Ghost was the rider of the camel. When Sarah saw the rider on the camel, at first she thought it was a person, but when she looked more closely, she saw they didn't have eyes and they had this disgusting, toothy grin. They just couldn't be human to her, and so she had decided this must be the devil. But it would turn out her first instinct was right. This was a person. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face, making it look like he had no eyes, and gave him this huge toothy grin because there was no flesh there. Now, we don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is at some point he was riding this camel. This camel escaped, he died, and somehow didn't fall off. And his dead body remained in an upright, seated position on this camel. And then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back, giving the impression that it was the devil riding on a monster. Today, the Red Ghost remains a local legend in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of a camel in a small Arizona town called Quartzist.